broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Working Through Stress, Practical Tips for Performing Under Pressure, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Dr. Kayla Labarge. My name is Sarah, and I will moderate today's webinar. We'll last about an hour or so, and if you have any questions, go ahead and use your chat box that you have there in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can type those in. I'll answer some as they come in while the presentation's going on. We'll have time at the end to answer some questions, and any questions we don't get to answer, we will reply back in our blog, and you'll get an email with that as well. So let me welcome today's presenter. We are fortunate enough today, and you should be able to see her here hopefully on webcam.
Hello guys, nice to meet you all. I'm so happy you're here.
This is Dr. Kayla Labarge. Kayla is a highly skilled organizational psychologist and executive coach at Equilibria Leadership Consulting. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Georgia Southern University. Kayla believes that with awareness and willingness, we have everything we need within us to be our best professional selves. It just takes commitment and hard work. She has a strong research and assessment background and is a well-published author with publications in the fields of positive psychology, resiliency, clinical outcomes, and stress-related challenges. Welcome, Kayla, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. I wanted you guys to all get a chance to see what I look like, so that way throughout the rest of this webinar, you get a sense that there is a real person on the other end of the webinar. I will be turning my webcam off once we get started, just to kind of turn down any distractions that it may cause. And I just wanted to take a second to elaborate on the purpose behind this webinar is really to get down to the nitty-gritty around workplace stress. We all experience stress at work, and it's my hope that by the end of the webinar today, you have a practical toolbox of tips that you can take with you metaphorically to work to help you to decrease the negative impact that stress can have. So I'm going to shut down my webcam now. It's very amazing that you all are here, and we'll move forward with the presentation. So to get started, we're going to do a poll. And really this poll is just to kind of get a sense of what our audience looks like. How are they viewing stress? And so Sarah is going to take over in a second to run the poll. Thank you, Sarah. And so the first poll question that I'd like you all to read and answer is, first, slowing down is not possible in today's 24/7 world. So I want you to select either true or false for that, because we all live in this really unique technological space where everything, information, our knowledge base is growing at ever rapid paces. And so tell me, is it true or false that slowing down is not possible for you in today's 24/7 world? And we're going to give a few seconds for polls to kind of gather in.
We're getting a good response. It's really neat to see how fast it jumped at one point, but then how it's kind of like evening out here a little bit. Sort of interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and share these results so everybody should see them.
Wow. So we have about 40% of people feeling like slowing down is not possible, right? And this is a really interesting finding. I want the people who answered that they don't feel like they can slow down, I want you to know that that is a normal experience today. So for the 60% of people who found that to be false, I'm happy that you're finding that time to slow down, and we're going to discuss ways that you can continue to do that. And so let's switch to the next poll question to get a little bit deeper insight into stress and how it's impacting people. And the second poll question, which Sarah is going to bring up now, is true or false? Performance depends on one's ability to make sacrifices in order to meet demands. And so these sacrifices could be, in order to be highly productive at work, I have to sacrifice my physical health. In order to be highly productive at work, I need to sacrifice time with my kids, time with my family. So take a moment now to answer true or false. Performance depends on one's ability to make sacrifices in order to meet demands.
We've still got people responding, so we'll give it another couple seconds here.
Perfect. And thank you. I'm so excited about the enthusiastic response on these first two polls. I know that stress is such an evocative topic, and I hope that we can make it a little bit less scary by the end of this webinar.
Well, this is interesting.
Wow, very, very interesting. So pretty much a flip, right? And we kind of expect that based on what we saw earlier. This question is kind of a flip on that first question. And so we have 60% of people that believe that maintaining high performance depends on one's ability to make sacrifices in order to meet demands. Whereas 40% of people are feeling like, I'm able to find more of the balance where I don't feel like sacrifice is happening. And that may be due to support, that may be due to organization. And we'll talk more about some of the coping resources we can bring to make sure that the 60% of people who feel like they're sacrificing a lot to stress, that they have something that balances out, that makes it feel like there's reciprocity, like what they're giving is also what they're getting. And so Sarah, thank you so much for pulling up each of these polls. I think they, again, provide us some insight into what our audience looks like. And so I mentioned earlier, for the people who are feeling a lot of workplace stress, this is the norm. In fact, 24% of adults report experiencing extreme levels of stress. This means 1 out of every 4 people on this call right now are experiencing extreme levels of stress at work. Now, let's continue to understand what that statistics means. 43% of adults report that in the past month, stress has caused them to lie awake at night. And I know I've been there. I've been there where I'm trying to go to sleep at night and my mind is on about everything I did that day or everything I have to do the next day. And when stress starts to get so strong that it's impacting sleep, it's having this almost double compound effect, because not only is our mind and our brain really stressed out, but our body is now not getting to recover. And we only have one body and one brain. So these are important statistics to take note of. And then lastly, around 34% of adults, 1 in every 3 adults, report that their stress has only increased over this past year. Now take a moment to think about that, and take a moment to think of over this past year, we're coming to the end of the year, we're coming to the holiday season, where we're in the holiday season really, and 34% of adults are reflecting back on this past year and thinking, wow, this year has been more stressful than any year before. So if you feel like you're one of those 34% of people, I encourage you to please listen with an open mind today. Again, my goal is to provide you with some ways to decrease that stress. So before we go any further, let's just define stress. As a clinical psychologist, I'm trained in clinical psychology. And for me, as a scientist, the best way to face any fear is to just name it. And so first, let's just name and define what stress is. Stress is defined as the non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. Now notice, this does not say stress is a negative bodily response. This just says it's a non-specific response. It's the brain's response to any demand, okay? So, for example, I know that later this week, it's my partner's birthday. I know that I have a list of things that I need to do. And when I think of that list, I have a response, right? Because my brain is responding, oh, you're turning me on, you're churning, you're trying to figure out the way to meet this demand, right? And change can trigger stress. That change can be positive or negative. So for example, a positive trigger might be you're getting married this weekend. And you're stressed because you're just so excited and you want everything to go perfectly. Whereas a negative trigger might be, you missed a deadline and it resulted in you kind of getting some really negative feedback from your boss. It can be real or perceived. So stress can be the deadline, right? That you're working up towards that you might miss. But it can also be perceived. It can be, I'm worried that in the future I won't reach my long-term career goals. And it can be recurring in both short or long term. So, when I think of this, I think of people who have gone through divorce proceedings while also having to maintain being at work, right? And being highly productive at work. And I think of the long-term reoccurring stress this is a trigger as you're having to kind of work around the ickiness and negotiation that a divorce can sometimes bring. So it can also feel reoccurring. So I write this because so often we confuse stress as being something negative, something that we don't want to have. And I am experiencing some issues changing my slide. So if Sarah, you could help me out. Thank you. So we're moving right along. We have an idea of how we perceive stress. We have an idea of what stress actually is. So now I want you to take that paper and pen, your hands out, and on the notes section for this slide or on a pad that you have around, I want you to take a moment to list some of your most common workplace stressors. So common workplace stressors could be, you have a colleague that works next to you that's really loud all day, and it's really stressful for you because it distracts you. Another common workplace stressor is maybe you just have a bad boss, and it's not always on the boss, but sometimes you have a bad boss, and waking up every morning and thinking about going to work, it's stressful, right? Maybe one of your common workplace stressors is that you run a startup. And the inherent risk that comes with running a startup is part of your everyday stress, being an entrepreneur. So I'm going to give you just about 10 more seconds to list some of your common workplace stressors before we flip the slide to the next slide. Okay, so moving right along. Now we know the things that trigger our stress, those common workplace stressors. We're moving right along to this. When things are stressful at work, when you're triggered, when these things are all happening, how does it impact your performance? So we're doing a functional analysis on stress at work. What happens to your performance when these stressors get evoked? When you have to wake up every morning, go to work with a leader you don't believe in, or with your noisy colleague who might work next door, or even with just the high performance and motivation that you have for your startup to survive. How does it impact your performance? And again, stress is neither good nor bad in most cases at work. So identifying some positive ways, if you can, as well as some negative ways to kind of expand our perspective on stress and how we're beginning to conceptualize and respond to it. So again, I'll give about 10 more seconds for you to finish kind of jotting down, just free associating what comes up when you think about when things are stressful at work, how does it impact your performance? Wrapping that up, going on to the next slide, taking it a bit deeper. We've all experienced stress, and I don't want to come into this webinar assuming that you haven't tried many logical, practical, amazing things to cope with it. And I imagine that some of these have been quite successful, whereas others have been less successful. So now I just want you to list a few things that have worked, right? Because again, my goal is at the end of this webinar, you have an idea, you have this toolbox that you can bring with you to work to help decrease stress. And part of that is knowing what is already working for you in terms of managing workplace stress. So it could be that you've taken up the really nasty habit of smoking, right? And it works to decrease your stress at work, but we need to start to identify if it's really useful in the long term, right? But writing it down, if it's decreased stress, maybe as a part of your new regime, you started to walk over lunch to, decrease kind of the physical agitation associated with stress. I work with an executive team that they spend 30 minutes of every lunch walking in circles around their complex and just catching up on what's happening and being together as a team. And just the physical exercise paired along with that interpersonal contact has decreased their executive team stress in numerous ways. So wrapping that up and going to the next slide now, starting to go deeper into this idea that they have both good and bad types of stress. And so often, again, we get focused, we get stuck on the bad stress. And so distress is the negative stress. Distress has a deleterious impact on our functioning. It causes anxiety or concern. It can be short or long term. So it can feel like really acute, like, oh my God, in this moment, I'm overly stressed and overwhelmed. Or it could be long term where it feels more chronic. I've been at this job for a year now, and I feel like I've been stressed every day of it, right? It can be perceived as outside of your coping abilities. And most of the time, distress it feels like something out of your control that you're not equipped to handle. And again, that's the importance of building this toolbox. So you're equipped to handle many various types of stress. It feels unpleasant. And bad stress decreases your performance. So that's how you know the difference, is that distress decreases your performance and the quality of your work over time. And it can lead to mental and physical problems, which we will talk more about. But that, as you saw, between one in every 4 and 1 in every 3 individuals is experiencing these mental and physical problems related to distress. On the other hand, we also have eustress. And eustress is that good stress. Eustress is the stress that we've all tapped into to motivate us, to focus our energy. You know, when I think about the stress that must go into being like an Olympic athlete, right? The stress on the body, the stress on the mind in terms of meeting stringent goals, being very disciplined. That is tapping into the eustress, getting your physiology, the physiology of stress to work for you. And as a result of that, is short term, because our brain and our body can only function for so long at a stressful state. It's perceived as within our coping abilities. So when we perceive, okay, this task ahead of me, this thing that's making me really stressed, I can deal with it. I have what it takes to overcome it. It changes that essential perception of stress as being distress. It feels exciting, you know, instead of feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to have a panic attack. It feels more like, oh my adrenaline is pumping. I'm ready to go. And this type of stress has a tendency to improve our performance. Now I want to make a note here on the research between stress and performance. And what we find is that there's actually a U-shaped relationship between stress and performance. All this means is that there's an optimal level of good stress to impact performance. So we don't want to be too stressed when we have to perform, and we don't want to be too laid back and laissez-faire when we need to perform. We want to find that middle point where stress is both pushing us, but also making sure that it's not going into that maladaptive level of stress where we start to feel like impacting the balance in other areas of our life. And so as a part of this, and this is not to negate anyone who experiences stress on a daily basis, or anyone who experiences the resulting anxiety that can accompany it. But really what this comes down to is that perception is key. And that perception is everything when we deal with stress. What one person perceives as stressful can feel challenging and motivating to another person. And so I like this quote because I think it really differentiates that distress. And so high amounts of stress and the perception that stress impacts health, these are two things, are each associated with poor health individually. So when they become combined, it's like a combined effect, right? Individuals who perceived that stress affected their health and reported a large amount of stress had an increased risk of premature death. Now, this is a scary quote, but this quote is not meant to scare anyone. This is just to show how powerful the combination of stressful life events, which are inevitable, when paired with a stressful perception and a negative perception of those events over the course of time, correlated with premature death, dying before the average rate of mortality for your age group. And this is a striking finding because, again, when we think of stress as physiological, it only echoes the fact that we need to take more time to take care of our body and take care of our mind. So, some common responses to stress that you may be experiencing include digestive issues, right? Things like your stomach feels upset, yawning, fatigue, you feel tired all the time because your body and your mind are literally on overdrive trying to continue to function through stress. You might experience panic, mood instability like anger or sadness. The more common acute types of stress responses include things like starting to sweat or fidget, or your mouth might get dry. Your heart might start to beat faster. You feel those palpitations in your chest. You might start to breathe shallowly and quickly. You might get quiet and isolate yourself. Or you might start to self-sabotage, either through negative thoughts or self-sabotaging the support system needed to help you work through the stress. Again, these are common responses to stress because this is what it looks like for most people. And so if you're noticing some of these might be repetitive from what you wrote earlier in terms of triggers and responses, I want to again reiterate that you're not alone. And so now I want to show this very scientific video, and I say that pun intended, about what stress might look like, the 10 stages of your workday. And I hope, if nothing else, this video provides a respite from a very serious topic like stress, and allows you to decompress and take a few moments to reflect and laugh on what it looks like when we show up to work. So I'm going to let Sarah now take over to play this short video on workplace stress and the 10 stages that we may all experience.
Shake it, baby.
Perfect. So I hope you all can see that video. Sarah, just to interact with you a little bit, I couldn't see it on my screen. So I'm just wanting to check in that all went well in terms of flow for the rest of the audience.
Oh no, I have a couple that did chime in that they couldn't see it, but I do have some that did say they could see it. So it looks like it's a split mix there. I'm not sure what happened, because it's like half the people coming in are saying, "Oh yeah, I saw it fine," and others are saying they didn't. So we'll have to do some behind the scenes here. I'll have to do some tech support on that, but I'll email the video so you guys can see it after the session too, so you get the feel for what it was.
Perfect. And I apologize to anyone who couldn't see the video, but it's really funny. So once Sarah sends out the link, check it out. But really what it was it's just a funny kind of video about how babies sometimes respond so similarly to how we might respond to stress at work. And so for those of you who could see it, I hope you got a laugh out of it. I know when Sarah and I were preparing this webinar, we certainly got a laugh out of just drawing the parallels to just how sometimes the responses we have to stress even show up in babies. And so we really just, we laughed about it. And so now for the rest of the webinar, I really want to focus on this toolbox that I've been talking about. I feel like I've given you this nice foundation of what stress is. You should be getting a better idea through your own reflecting through these prompts, what it looks like for you and how it might show up at work. And now I want to talk a little bit more about what can you do about it. Stress is inevitable. I've said that many times throughout this webinar, but what can you do to face it, right? When stress knocks on your door at work, what can you do? What tools can you bring with you? And when I was thinking about it, I kind of broke it down into 4 main domains. So 4 areas that I think if we could build some tools, some tolerance around, they would definitely impact workplace stress. And these include the first domain, which is physical and physiological. The second, which is relationships and dynamics. The third, efficiency and organization. And 4th, the intrapersonal and mental. And basically what I'm saying is when I point out these 4 domains is that these are the areas where stress is going to have the biggest impact on your life. And so intervention should be aimed at decreasing these. So let's look at the first domain, the physical and the physiological. And I start here because really when we get down to it, our brain and our body, they're just physical things. And if we don't take care of them, they won't last, right? The brain, I compare it to a computer because it is the most powerful computer that we know. And just think about it. If you left your computer running and you just challenged it to have unending tasks, your computer would eventually crash. And your brain is no different. And your body is no different. So we only get one body. We only get one brain. We have to take care of it. And there are easy ways to take care of it. For those people who at the beginning of the poll said that there is no time in today's world to shut down and shut off and slow down, I challenge you on that. It's that perception. It's about being creative and finding small ways every day to recover. So the first way, the easiest way, is finding ways to take breaks. I recommend 15 minutes every 4 hours, and it doesn't have to be all at once. It could be 7 minutes every 2 hours. It could be 5 minutes every hour, right? I want it to be so you feel like your mind is having brief moments to shut off. Sleep. If you find that you're one of those people who, again, in the poll, stress is keeping you lying awake at night, you're one of the 1 out of 3 people who are saying that. Sleep is essential. Finding ways to get the appropriate amount of sleep. I'll talk about the Headspace app a little bit later when we talk about mindfulness, but I love sleep sounds. They're a way for your mind to both be focused on something while also it's not requiring any sustained focus that's actually attentional. And so I recommend sleep sounds if you're one who has an active mind, allowing your mind to be active but on something neutral. Next, exercise. I'm totally guilty of this. It's sometimes, I think most people, when they get stressed, their personal care falls to the wayside, and that's the worst. In fact, when we're stressed is when we actually have to show up the most for ourselves in terms of physical. And so making sure that you have 2 or more days a week, if you're feeling really stressed, of exercise, and this can be 30 minutes of just walking, of making time. Nutrition. Consuming a healthy variety of foods. I work with an executive who is so overloaded and who has been for a long time, and has somehow sustained on a diet of Cheetos for lunch. And let me tell you, think of how you can function if your body is sustaining on Cheetos. Not going to be great. Going to be cheesy, but not going to be great. And so making sure that you're consuming a healthy variety of foods. And making sure that you're also scheduling time for recovery. And when I say scheduling time, I mean, it doesn't have to be strictly scheduled. It can just be that you're making time for it. So that could be counting breaths. When you notice you're triggered and you're stressed, you notice your heart's pounding a little bit faster than you'd like it, take a moment to take a few deep breaths, right? Walking. One tactic that I used to use when I was in practice, when I was in a clinical practice, is, your clients, you're with clients back to back to back, individual clients all day. And so where I would find recovery was in my walk to the restroom, right? In between clients, that would be my time to just like be in my space, to just only focus on the present and being there. And then, like I mentioned, for sleep, using calming sounds. So if you find that work is a stressful place, activating some of those calming sounds, if appropriate, within your workplace or at home. The second domain that stress impacts at work is efficiency and organization. And this is probably the domain that gets us most in trouble with supervisors, or when we work on a team where our performance is really necessary for the overall performance of the team. And it's no surprise that if your mind and your body have been stressed and you've been kind of in that physiological high stress response, that it would be harder to be efficient, right? Because you're already being pulled in so many different directions. It feels like you're juggling a million balls. And so the first tip is stop juggling. Quit multitasking. When you're at a point of distress, when stress gets too strong at work, you can't multitask effectively anymore. In fact, multitasking could be your downfall. So quit multitasking, sustain your attention on one thing at a time. So that way, again, it doesn't feel like you're juggling a ton of balls and dropping a ton of balls at the same time. Next, reduce distractions and notifications. So again, I work with another leader who, she knows about herself that she needs an hour and a half a day alone to get tasks done. She has a very high task-driven job, and she really values people, and she really values an open door policy. But she also knows that when her door is open, people are coming in, people are talking, and she's less likely to get the things done that she needs to get done. So making sure that you're reducing distractions and notifications if you can. This also includes your phone. I just want to point out, just for fun's sake, how many times you've picked up your phone during this webinar to check it. Maybe you got an email and your phone ding and it activated all the dopamine receptors, the reward receptors in your brain, and you're like, yes, people like me, I'm getting emails. Reduce that when you're stressed. Again, the idea is to sustain focus on one task to get the most efficient, high quality product out of that task. Time management audit specifically is key. So if you're saying you're overwhelmed and stressed at work, but the first hour you're at work, you're scrolling through Facebook and Instagram, there needs to be an audit on that time, because that time could be used spending productively. Now, on the other hand, I do want to say that if getting 5 minutes on Facebook or whatever is part of your recovery, that scheduled recovery time we talked about before, go ahead. But that has to be intentional and used as a reward for managing your time effectively. And one way that the most productive people do this is by scheduling. They forecast what their day is going to need. This doesn't mean that they're inflexible, but they forecast what time they think is going to be allotted where, and they stick to time deadlines. They don't let deadlines pass, and they push themselves to stick to their schedule. Delegate where possible. So if you find that you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed and you work on a team, ask for help. See if there are other people on your team whose strengths you can leverage in this time to take advantage of your support system. This can also be at home, right? So often our family members are people we delegate some of that venting to. Again, where possible. And then create a productive workspace. So a lot of times organization is impacted by stress, and that again, it's not a surprise. But your workspace doesn't have to be disorganized because your mind is. In fact, getting your workspace organized can sometimes help to organize your approach. And so making sure that if you have a ton of things everywhere and you can't find things and your desk is a mess and your office is a mess, making sure that you're creating a productive workspace that lends itself to organization and time management and scheduling. The third domain is our relationships and the dynamics at work, and at home and other places in our life. And when we're stressed, take a moment to think of how that impacts our relationships with others. We don't show up to be our best selves when we're overwhelmed in our relationships. We need a bit more from our relationships when we're overwhelmed. And as a result, a lot of times we need to be able to give a bit more. And so being aware of those dynamics, awareness at first to your reactions to stress. So if when things go really bad at work, you have a tendency to come home and scream at your kids, being aware of that reaction to stress. If when you're at work and your boss comes down on you hard and your reaction is to shut down, being aware of that reaction to stress and how it will impact relationships with those people. To add to that, understanding your own conflict style as well as the conflict styles of others. So an example of that, if you have a tendency to get really aggressive and energetic and to yell when you're stressed or overwhelmed, considering what that conflict style might have, what impact that conflict style might have on others who may be in the office. When they get stressed, they have a tendency to hide under the desk, right? Or to isolate. And understanding how, again, the intent you have versus the impact that might have on others. So if your intent is to release the stress by yelling, being aware of the consequences that will have on your relationships and those dynamics, and choosing appropriately to get the most out of what you need at work. For all those yes people out there, the setting clear boundaries is for you. Because a lot of times we get overwhelmed at work because we say yes to everyone and everything that they're asking us to do. And so setting clear boundaries, being able to say no whenever you need to say no, when you do feel really overwhelmed. And the same thing goes for at home and at work. If you need time alone to process what's happening, ask for it. Right? Again, in the scenario where you just got tough feedback from your boss and your boss says, tell me how you feel about it. What are you going to do to change? If in that moment you freeze, being able to set a clear boundary and say, I'm processing what you're saying. I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I'm going to need a second to just process to come back to you with an answer for that. That's another example of setting clear boundaries. Avoiding enacting old patterns. So this goes back to that awareness of reactions to stress. Avoid enacting old patterns, specifically ones that don't work. Okay, so again, if you're the CEO who, when a mistake is made, they come down hard on their COO, acknowledging what has that pattern resulted in. Especially in terms of relationship dynamic, productivity, engagement, buy-in, all these things necessary for productivity and satisfaction at work. How is stress impacting it, and being avoidant of enacting old maladaptive patterns. And then being transparent and reaching out for help when you can. Being vulnerable is so difficult, so I don't want to discount that. However, I found that so many people at work, when they just finally just break down and reach out for help, they're so much better off for it because they're able to get the help and support that they need that they weren't otherwise able to get when they were just kind of sticking themselves on this lonely island of stress. And so being able to acknowledge, I have reached my limits. I've reached my leadership limit. I've reached my limits to cope with stress. And I need some help now, and that's okay. And I want to acknowledge that just being on this webinar today is a part of that transparency, a part of that reaching out for help. I know it's a little bit different because we're just connected through this webinar, but this is a perfect example about a way to reach out for help. So I want to say I appreciate every single person who's on the call that's been vulnerable enough to admit to themselves that they can grow in this area. Before I jump into the intrapersonal and mental side, I just want you to read this for me. Take a moment. I'm going to give you a few seconds to just read this for me. So I really, really love this as an example of just how powerful our brain is at solving problems, right? So if you can take a look at this now, you'll notice that you were able to read this nonsense because your brain is taking in the big chunks of information, deciphering it for you and organizing it for you before you even have to do it intentionally. Take a moment to just be aware of how powerful your brain is. So, as a result of it being so powerful, our intrapersonal, that self state, that internal state, and that mental state can be impacted by prolonged stress, right? Our ability to, if you could go back, Sarah, to the previous, actually, I can do it, I think. Coming back to this previous slide, over time, if I were to come and bring this to you when you were at a time of heightened stress, your mind would have a little bit more difficulty organizing these patterns. And I think that's important to note. It shows the impact of stress over time on our mind's ability to just do simple functions. So what are some ways that we can keep ourselves, that internal well-being, and our mental space, our mental health in check? Well, look, the number one prescription to stress is mindfulness. For those of you who are saying, oh, mindfulness, or I don't do mindfulness, I don't meditate, I want to challenge you here because the research in this area is profound. And I want to bring your attention back to that premature death quote. The research in the area of mindfulness and its impact on reducing stress is just as profound as that quote. And I recommend the Headspace app. I think it's this beautiful, well approachable. It's a wonderful app on your smartphone that you can get. You can also do it on the computer. It takes 10 minutes or less a day to just kind of get present, to give your mind that space to shut off, right? Going back to the mind as a computer, we want it to be able to recover. We want it to be able to sleep and have moments of rest. So practicing mindfulness is one of the best ways to decrease stress. And mindfulness, it isn't anything spiritual or crazy. It's defined as being present in a non-judgmental way. Just being engaged in the present moment with whatever there. Not judging, not using your brain as a machine to solve problems, just being. The next thing I really like for dealing with the intrapersonal stress or the mental stress from work is identifying your strengths and encouraging your coworkers to do the same. I love the Be a Character assessment. I use it both in organizational and clinical settings to help clients and executive coaching clients figure out their strengths. It ranks 24 factor analyzed strengths, the top 5 being the core strengths that you bring to work every day, and the bottom 3 being ones that you could bring to work to better manage stress. And I find that knowing what your strengths are and where they lie really allow you to show up with your armor on when stress gets really bad. So for example, for me, I have a very high stress job. I work as a consultant and an organizational psychologist with very, very successful people. And as a result, I need a time to decompress, to de-stress. And one of my highest strengths is appreciation of beauty and excellence. And so if I know that I'm going to meet with a client who I'm having to give 150% with that session, I'm going to make sure that on the way there, I'm taking in the beautiful flowers and how beautiful the day is. Because just those small seconds decrease that negative perception of stress and the negative outcomes it has on me mentally. And again, another strength that you'll find if you choose to take this assessment is love of learning. And I would say that all of you have activated that strength by choosing to be a part of this webinar, and just learning more about what you can do to manage stress and what you can do to perform when it's around. Because listen, guys, it's gonna be around. And then focus on maintaining some type of work-life balance. So again, this importance of having time to shut off, and making sure that you're giving yourself that time. And then lastly, savoring moments of happiness, wellness, and goodness that happen at work. So when I say that, again, our mind is a problem-solving machine. And as a result, it sometimes gets caught up on the problems. And so making sure that at work, you're noticing when things are really good amidst the chaos or the stress, right? Noticing whenever you're having lunch in the common lunchroom and everyone's together, and noticing what that feels like despite the stress being around. Are moments where you just notice other human beings just being really supportive around others, and taking time to savor those moments to kind of counteract that negative effect of stress. And so to finish up this webinar, I want to remind you that adopting new habits takes time, patience, and recognizing that there will be setbacks. As long as everybody on this webinar is a human being, you are not perfect, and there will be setbacks and mistakes and obstacles. And it's important to acknowledge that on your journey through managing stress, to know that when those things happen, they're just part of the ride. So to close out, I want you to take out your journal again. And as we've done this functional analysis, we're coming to the end on now, what are you going to do differently? So consider what benefits can result from making small changes to your current approaches to workplace stress. So using some of the skills I've talked about today, which ones are you going to try? Commit to experimenting with these small changes and note the impact that they have on your stress level. So right now, again, we're just going to take a few more seconds to just any of the interventions or tools that stood out to you, making note of them, and also making note possibly of situations where you might want to try them. So for example, with the noisy neighbor, with the noisy colleague neighbor, maybe those calming sounds might be a helpful block for your office, right? That decreases your stress instantly. It might be something you want to try. Maybe the physical exercise component really spoke to you, and you're going to get people in your office together to start maybe a daily exercise routine that decreases the overall stress of your team. So just taking time, not only now, but throughout the rest of the day, throughout the rest of your life, to consider the small changes you can continuously make to decrease workplace stress, and the negative impact that it has on you, making stress work for you. And so again, I hope that we can pop the balloon on stress by the end of this webinar. And I appreciate all of you tuning in. That I am done with the information that I am now presenting. And so I would love to take any questions that haven't been covered throughout the presentation. Sarah is going to come back on and moderate some of that throughout the remainder of the webinar. But again, thank you all for being here, and I hope that there are some great takeaways that you can practically use today and moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. We do have some questions that have come in, so go ahead and keep sending those in. We'll get to as many as we can. And we had a question really early on, Kayla, and I know you covered a little bit of it, but I thought you might be able to speak towards this a little bit more thoroughly. But it's about the question is here, what about those who don't think they are stressed, but actually show physical signs of it?
Yeah, so again, perception is a very powerful thing, right? So if you're showing signs of stress, you're stressed, right? If we get down to how we define stress, it is a physiological response. Your mind is a tricky thing, and I hate to tell everyone this, but your mind, it lies to you all the time, and it tells mistruths, and it makes errors, right? It's a part of being human. But if your body, if you're noticing your heart is beating, if you're noticing you're not sleeping well, if you're noticing you're crying, you're sweating, stress is there, right? And the next step is, obviously as a coping skill, this person is using telling themselves, I'm not stressed, I'm not stressed. Okay. And so taking a second to acknowledge, what does that coping skill do, right? Because that's like smoking cigarettes, right? When you smoke a cigarette, it's telling your mind you're not stressed, because it's activating other physiological responses. Same thing with this response in my mind, is that telling yourself you're not stressed. First question, has it made you not stressed? If you're still feeling physiological responses, the answer is no. So it's not a good coping skill if it doesn't work in the long run. So then asking yourself, what am I willing to do differently? What am I willing to commit to that isn't telling myself I'm not stressed, to deal with the actual stress that's there? I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that definitely was really, really insightful. Absolutely, absolutely. So early on, when you had asked people things that were stressful, one of the patterns that came out was having multiple managers or having multiple deadlines that were really pressured by managers. And so this concept of kind of boss stress seemed to really be present with the group today. And so we got a couple questions around that. So just to kind of summarize that, one thing I thought you might want to talk about is, how to kind of cope with that workplace stress when the boss is more kind of either controlling, either whether it's workflow or deadlines or a lot of, involvement there. Can you speak towards that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I'm so happy that we're getting that response, because I think a lot of people who are really stressed at work, it sometimes does have to do with just being in a negative culture or environment, or just having a bad boss. Like I don't want to blame it all on the boss, but bosses are human beings too. So acknowledging that. I think that any of the skills discussed today are individual things that anyone can do to counteract the negative impact of a bad boss, or a negative manager, or multiple deadlines. So specifically, when anyone who asked about the relationship side of things, I want to turn you back to the slide on relationships and dynamics. So the reason why I broke down into those 4 domains is so you could break down for yourself how stress shows up for you at work. So if the stress is around interpersonal conflict with your manager, or interpersonal influence from your boss, I want to redirect you back to that slide that talked about being aware of your old patterns, being aware of the difference in your conflict style, your communication style as compared to your manager or your boss, and how those things might flow and how they might not, and ways you can initiate more balance for yourself, right? And then, on top of it, when we talk about poor leadership, and I some of the blogs that I submitted, they actually speak to this, I believe. But when it comes to a bad boss, it really is, my greatest feedback kind of has to be is that you have to find a way to bring strength to work. Will this cure your boss? No. But you have to find a way to create safe spaces at work that feel productive and meaningful for you. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that many people have probably tried that, and that if it is within your means after a certain time, if you have done everything that you can to function under poor leadership, and you just feel like, okay, no, now this is not a me thing. This is a them thing, which it sometimes is. Being aware of when you need to cut your losses if you can. And I want to acknowledge that that's not a privilege that everyone has, to be able to leave their job under situations like this. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a certain point where not cutting said losses can be deleterious in other ways for the individual that make it so you can't perform at work anyway. So it becomes a negative loop. But I would point everyone back to any of these coping skills, specifically the ones that feel like they're under the domain that you're pinpointing, should be helpful.
Great. One of the pieces we kind of haven't gotten into yet, but I think this audience, it would resonate really well with them, is for you to talk a little bit about some of the cultural aspects of stress, and it almost seems a point of pride sometimes, for people. It's like, how are you doing? Busy, busy, busy. I'm stressed out.
I'm one of those people.
Yeah. But there is, and then, you talk about a lot of the apps that are coming out. I use another app called Calm.
I love Calm.
LM, another free app. And, there is a lot more around reducing stress in the culture. So it does, to me, feel like this kind of, two big areas and a push-pull there, which I think is interesting. But, could you speak a little bit towards kind of some of your cultural thoughts around there?
So I want to dissect two separate meanings of culture in my answers to this question. So first, I want to talk about culture on a ethnic diversity, racial, and how stress can look differently in different cultures. So and it could relate to a point of pride. It could relate. I'm Southern. I'm from rural Louisiana, and I'm not from a place where if you're stressed, you talk about it. Right. So I'm from a culture where, you suck it up, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you do what you can with what you're given. But that gets us into trouble, because what we find is, for cultures like that, it goes right back to that first person who said they don't think they're stressed, but they have all the physiological symptoms. The stress doesn't go away because we say we need to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, or because we say our culture can't accept it. The stress just gets manifested in a different way. The stress will get manifested in headaches, stomach aches, all. So I think when I think of culture in terms of different representations from a westernized versus easternized cultures versus more individualized to collective versus rural to urban, I think that we all experience that physiological response to stress in the same way, because we are all humans who have brains, but the presentation given one's culture may look a little bit differently. And I would also say that, institutionalized kind of healthcare systems have also contributed to that, where minority groups don't feel as though they have a safe outlet to talk about stress in the mental health or in the medical realm. So first, I want to talk about it from that cultural perspective, is that you can expect that different cultures will experience and manifest stress differently. On the workplace culture side, I think that, every workplace culture looks differently, but I think on this side, the individual has major impact on what they bring to work. So when I think of workplace culture and stress and its impact, I want to encourage everyone to bring positive vibes to work, to bring their strengths and their best self to work, because when we do that, it's like a ripple effect, and it only makes those around us want to do it. And if only a few people do that, we can change the way that workplace culture looks. So I hope that addresses that question, Sarah.
Yes, great. Thank you. So we are out of time today for questions. Feel free. I'll stay on the line here for another few minutes. You can type those in. We will put those questions up on our blog, so you can take a look at those. If you are interested in more on this topic in your organization, definitely check out Kayla and her consulting practice, Equilibria Leadership Consulting. You can get her contact information right on our website, and check out her work, and work with her directly as well. And hopefully we will see you on our next webinar. You found today to be informative, and we'll be back on the line here in another week. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again. So we're just going to stay on the line for a little bit longer and